Welcome to the Self-Carapist Podcast. Join me, Lorraine Moorhead, a licensed psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, and EMDR consultant, along with expert guests as we explore the approaches and modalities we've used and developed to support our clients' success. Our conversations and stories are designed to inspire new and seasoned clinicians to stay curious, prioritize self-care, and never stop learning. Today, I'm here with clinical social worker and author Sophia Vale-Galano in an important discussion on teenage anxiety, where we explore the unique challenges teens face, such as academic stress, social media, and delayed developmental stages. We examine how parents can shift from fixing and controlling to coaching and collaborating, and the links Sophia makes in her newly released book, Calming Teenage Anxiety, A Parent's Guide to Helping Your Teenager Cope with Worry. There are some great ideas woven throughout to add to your toolbox to work with teenagers and parents. We also dive into her publishing journey and insights for aspiring authors looking to share their message. Welcome, Sophia Vale-Galano.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you recently had a book come out. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. So I'm an LCSW, and I recently wrote a book called Calming Teenage Anxiety, A Parent's Guide to Helping Your Teenager Cope with Worry. I wrote this book really for parents, caregivers, guardians, adults that have a teen in their life that they're looking for practical tools, skills, and resources to help the teens and support the teens. So my goal with the book is to really provide a blueprint for people to pick up and just learn practical tools that they can begin applying to help teens in their lives.
Oh, that sounds so great. We have clinicians listening that work with all of the populations that you just outlined. And so I think it'll be really fun to talk more about how to bring everyone together and what information is going to be important for us to know. How did this book come about?
Yeah. So, and I'm sure, listeners can relate to this, so as a therapist, I work with teens and their families, and I have been for almost 11 years now. And I'm seeing this population in my private practice, then also working in this population, residential treatment centers and school settings. And, I have noticed kind of just a general need for more tools and skills. So, a lot of parents would come in and kind of know that their teen was struggling or know that something was going on, but didn't really know what to do. So the seed was kind of planted there. And then when it really hit me that I wanted to write this book, I wanted to have a guide for people to kind of get their hands on and just really easily reference, was, a number of years ago, I was giving talks at local schools. I would pick a different subject to speak with parents about, so I remember I did one on, substance use, vaping, depression, and I gave one on anxiety, on teenage anxiety. And I remember, I talk about this in kind of the introduction to my book, that the room was just completely filled. And it was the most crowded talk I ever gave. And the parents really wanted those practical tools. And that's when it kind of hit the nail on the head for me, that I was all right, it's time. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write this book so that we have it kind of all listed, and I can really provide very specific and concrete words to use and phrases for parents to lean on, and also what phrases, words, and actions for parents to avoid as well. A lot of parents, and again, I think, most therapists have seen this, working with families, is that, many parents mean really well with their actions, but wind up pushing the teen farther away. So I talk about that a lot as well, what parents can do, but also not do to help support their teen.
Oh, yeah, it makes so much sense. So out of all of the different topics that you came up with or that you pulled from your maybe private practice work to present to these schools, the one that filled the rooms that had people busting at the seams was teen anxiety.
Yes, exactly. And I think because there is, as I mentioned before, there's many conversations going on and a lot of dialogue around teen anxiety is out there. My kid is struggling. Teenagers today are suffering. We know that it's there, and people are talking about that a lot, but there really, I found, isn't kind of the follow-up of, well, what do we do given that. We know it's a problem, but how do we actually support and help? And I have found that, it's really tricky for adults, particularly parents, unless of course they're kind of schooled up in this field, for them to also identify what is kind of standard teenage behavior, what is actually concerning, when is anxiety, when is it actually anxiety versus, kind of typical adolescent development. And it's really tricky when it comes to anxiety, given, the stress that teenagers are presented with today.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. What are parents seeing that could have them asking, is this anxiety or is this developmentally typical?
Totally, totally. So oftentimes, I have parents that come to see my practice or parents who come to my talks and they say, okay, well, my teenager is moody. They don't want to hang out with me anymore. They are, kind of, hostile to me. They're cranky. They're isolative. They don't want to go to school. They don't want to do their assignments. What does that mean? And, what I really recommend for parents is to assess how often a teenager is struggling and to what extent. So I kind of pose this example. It's like a very sort of simple example here. But,
Hmm.
I encourage parents to think of if their teen, let's say, is nervous before an exam. So if there is a teen that's taking an exam, they're stressed, they're nervous, they're feeling anxious about it, but they take the exam, they sit through the exam, they are able to go get through the rest of their classes for the day, they complete their extracurricular activities, they go on with their social schedule, that it doesn't pose this hindrance to their life outside of the exam. Okay, something maybe we're not going to want to completely ignore or overlook, but we're going to take a different approach to the teen that, let's say, throws up before the exam or has a panic attack before the exam or refuses to go to school because of the exam or is unable to complete their other assignments because they're so preoccupied with the exam or doesn't want to hang out with their friends anymore because they're just fixated on the results of this exam. That's when we're going to want to take a closer look that maybe this is more anxiety and less kind of the standard teenage behavior. And we're going to want to look at how often that happens. So if, let's say, this happens to a teenager, once a year, okay, again, we're not going to overlook it. We're not going to pretend that it's nothing, but we're going to also, again, take a different approach for the teenager. Let's say this happens once a week or multiple times a week or a few times a month. We're going to want to look closer at that. Sometimes we do have off days and, teenagers are human beings and there are stresses, but we're really going to want to mindfully observe how often and to what extent a teenager is struggling.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you recommend tracking it in some way or just attuning to some of those things that you've seen?
I do recommend tracking, and I remind parents too, and when I work with clinicians who, are working with this population in their practices in schools or, whichever setting they're in, is also to really encourage and coach parents to track this not from a lens of judgment, but more of curiosity and kind of mindfulness versus like, okay, something's wrong with my teenager and like we need to fix it versus, okay, I'm noticing this is happening and I want to learn more. And when I work with the parents directly, that kind of the framework of sort of curious, inquisitive, I also encourage them to use that in their conversations with teenagers. I know it's a bit of a different subject, but really like curious, inquisitive is going to be a parent's best friend in navigating this topic.
Yeah, sure. What does curious and inquisitive look like compared to judgmental? What are some of the
Totally.
phrases or the actions you think you would see in one
Totally.
umbrella
Totally.
versus the other?
Totally. And, and first of all, and think since there's a lot of clinicians listening, I know might feel like a no-brainer to them, but I always like to remind everyone that, of course, there's going to be emergency exceptions to what I'm saying here. So, if a teen, obviously, if there's any, suicidality, self-harm, severe substance use, we're going to take a very different approach versus a kind of more gradual, inquisitive approach. I think what can happen sometimes, and parents often don't mean this, and this is where, I work with a teen a lot to have empathy and compassion, understanding for their parents, is the parents approach what's going on with the teenager wanting to fix or provide a solution, and it can come across as judgmental to the teenager. So oftentimes,
Mhm.
a parent will say, okay, my teen is struggling. My teen has anxiety. I sat them down and said, will you have anxiety before this test? Go for a walk or just meditate or it's going to be fine. And the parent is coming again from this loving stance. And those actually are very effective solution, but the teen doesn't want to hear that. What they hear is, okay, my feelings are being minimized or I'm being invalidated here. And this is where I encourage parents to, again, lean into that curious, inquisitive approach of seeking to learn more of what does that feel like to the teenager? How has
Mhm.
that been for you? Would you share a little bit more with me? How can I support you? And this is where it's almost like the verbiage of, being a therapist comes in very helpful, which is leaning on open-ended questions and coaching parents to um, uh, rely more on those approaches, open ended questions versus like a one sided conversation. So we want to lean on a two-sided dialogue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you bring up a great point that we've all heard teen characterize, oh, I just got yelled at. My teacher yelled at me. My parent yelled at me. And then you either heard it and thought, oh, I thought it was just a clear conversation, or you didn't
Totally.
hear it, but upon gathering more data. So I think it's a great awareness that it can feel judgmental, even if it's not sent that way or intended that way. So just being really mindful of how to continue the dialogue, gather as much information as possible, and then work from there.
Definitely, definitely. And oftentimes, too, what I've seen, and again, this is from loving and caring and concerned parents,
Yes.
so I remind parents too that if, let's say, they have utilized these approaches, not to be too hard on themselves, because again, they're coming from a good place, is, parents will also think of themselves as teenagers and say, well, like when I was a teen, this is
Mhm.
what helped me. Or like, you know, well, this worked for me. Or why don't you just do this? And a lot of my work with a parent is also helping them gain a sense of empathy that teens are living a very different world than they were as teenagers, too. And that's helpful for us as clinicians to coach parents through that as well.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? What do
Yeah.
you see as some of the major differences between kids growing up in this generation versus their parents came of age?
Definitely, definitely. No, and it's a great question. And oftentimes, even just, parents becoming aware of this can feel very enlightening for them and very
Yeah.
empowering. They feel more knowledgeable, they feel more up to date with what's going on and can help them gain more empathy. So I start, by reminding parents, that there are many causes to teen anxieties today. And one of which they was around, when teenagers, or excuse me, when parents were teenagers themselves. And those are some more of the classic causes to anxiety. So, more of the biological changes, chemical changes in the brain's still developing, hormonal changes. So, those kind of classic factors. But then in conjunction, we have these newer causes that can contribute to anxiety, such as social media, technology, enhanced academic stress, collegiate competition. There are these sort of, so it's the two of them combined can add even more stress. And oftentimes, when parents can take a step back and say, oh, wow, if I had to go through adolescence again and it was broadcast over the internet for everyone to see, and I was constantly comparing myself, okay, I can imagine myself feeling a little more anxious or maybe feeling more stressed or more overwhelmed, and it can help them understand.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do sometimes have the awareness that if my social contact was with me all the time and not just Monday through Friday at school,
Yes.
I think that would be stressful for me too.
Totally, 100%. And in my book, I chat about this is that oftentimes parents, like, I appreciate you bringing that point, will say, okay, well, I felt like at least on the weekends, I had a bit of relief from maybe,
Mhm.
feeling judgment from my peers or feeling that I'm comparing myself to my peers or feeling that I'm in kind of like the pressures and the, kind of social competition of high school. Whereas now, for teenagers, it's at their fingertips. It's not just, in the hallways or in their classrooms. It's as soon as they go home, as soon as they, check their phone, and it sort of kind of is the way that it is now. And what do we do with that?
Yeah. What are some of the other important awarenesses about the social media piece? Because I know in your book you kind of lay out how there are cons to consider,
Mhm.
and there are also some things that might be positives.
Absolutely. Yes. No, thank you for asking that and bringing that up. So like I definitely take, let's call it a bit more of a harm reduction approach to technology and social media use where, and of course, again, emergency exceptions to this, but I really feel when parents or, adults, caregivers, guardians, again, coming from a loving and concerned stance, prohibit or restrict a teen from using social media, what happens is it actually backfires. So the teen feels very controlled. They feel that they're being treated like a child. They don't feel that their parent is a safe person that they can talk to. And then on top of it, what happens when the teen is 18 and moves out and they don't have the parent, monitoring their social media? They don't have maybe the effective habits or tools to know how to use that in a healthy way. So I take this stance of, instead of prohibiting or controlling, let's work together with the teen. Let's again have a conversation with the teen from a very mindful, curious stance of how the teen feels about social media. How do they feel when they're viewing certain pages or certain people,
Mm.
and having the parent encourage the teen, if the teen is noticing, okay, well, when I follow this person or this page, I feel really bad. My self esteem plummets. I notice I get in a really bad mood. This is where the parent can say, how about using the mute button or the restrict button? Or if it's someone that's really triggering to you, how about you temporarily unfollow them or block them, versus like, okay, just don't go on there anymore. And encouraging them maybe to integrate some more positive pages that they follow. And this is definitely going to take encouragement from the parent. I say most teens don't go on social media to follow pages with, inspirational quotes and, their hobby. I mean, some do with hobbies, but, most of the time it's to follow their friends, or influencers. But it's helpful for parents to say, hey, how about also following this page or following that page, which, is related to something you're interested in, or a page that has some, you know, positive quotes on there, even if you want to just sprinkle it in, even if it feels cheesy or silly, like who cares? But again, this is where the parent can actually work with the teen and use social media to better the teen versus to help, prevent the teen from feeling controlled.
I love this idea, this little internal assessment. I think
Hmm.
it could be valuable for anybody, period, on social media
Right.
because we know that a lot of people feel a little bit of comparison
Totally.
syndrome when they're scrolling. I was also thinking I love it as even it's in a clinician's office to do a little bit
Yes.
of journaling around it
Yeah.
because we really are so desensitized to the scroll that we're
Totally.
not yeah, we're not taking in every individual on the
Yes.
feed and, like, sitting with it and saying, "Oh, I feel a little bit of discomfort." I felt a little bit of tension rise up when I saw that. I had this urge to go start running or, like, to
Yes.
go, to set my drink aside or whatever I'm doing, and so I think really having that mindful minute of reflection is a really neat way to approach
Totally.
it.
Totally, totally. Because I come from the stance that I really do believe that not all social media is bad. I mean, and as clinicians, we know, yes, of course, there's a lot of junk on there, but there are pages that are actually run by very qualified professionals that even, can provide very helpful kind of like quick tips or resources for not just teens, but for anyone that's struggling, little strategies or tools that someone could see and say, oh, okay, I could start that today. Or even if they're scrolling and there's a page that says just a reminder to take a deep breath, and it's, oh, okay, actually that'd be good for me. So not all social media is bad, and plenty of teens actually talked to me and said, okay, well, I saw this page or I'm following this account and it really inspired me to start a new creative project or try this new hobby. But again, it's as a reminder, most teens are not going on social media for that purpose. So that's where it takes encouragement from parents and us as clinicians too, or, any adult figure in their life, to kind of gently nudge them towards it.
Yeah. Do you find throughout this process that they might identify entire social media platforms that they prefer not to use? Like, not just people or accounts to unfollow, but to say, actually, I really don't like what's on there for me on, say, Instagram. I
Yeah,
prefer the format of TikTok or vice
totally.
versa.
Totally. Yes. Yes. And I've definitely noticed that's changed throughout the years too. It's kind of the trends of social media platforms. And this is where, I feel it's helpful as a clinician again, and for parents or any adult to also say, well, how do you feel? If you're noticing that, let's say maybe you don't like what you're seeing on Instagram, do you feel like it's worth it to, like temporarily pause your Instagram use, not again saying like, well, don't go on there or like delete it, like, or you have to do a permanent deactivation of like, well, how do you feel about just pausing it and, going on TikTok instead? Or if you're going to go on social media for an hour, a day, how about you go on Instagram for 10 minutes, you go on TikTok for 15 minutes, of really working with the teen, in a way that feels good for them too.
Hmm. And I also hear a bit of a training opportunity for parents as well, because some of
Yes.
the vocabulary you used in terms of can we mute? Can
Yes.
we,
People are like, what
should
is
we
that?
delete?
Yeah,
Yeah, like there really is an opportunity to become familiar as
definitely.
parents in order to offer those ideas and supports to kids.
Yes, yes. No, 100%. And that is an important piece to remember, and I come back to this of for parents, just even having the knowledge can feel very empowering, particularly for parents where, let's say, they know that the teen is struggling. They know that it's just, kind of the wild world out there for teens today, but they're like, what do I do? Where do I start? Is just really getting educated and saying, okay, here are the platforms, here are the different features, here's what a teen is experiencing. This is what kind of a day in the life for a teen might look like. This is what it might feel like. Again, notice I'm saying might, because everyone is different, but it can help them feel, okay, I I'm a little more prepared to engage in these conversations because I'm schooled up.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think research indicates that there's optimal amounts of time to spend on social media before
Mhm.
internalizing symptoms start to increase. Have you come across anything like that?
I come from this stance of, again, kind of not like a one size fits all. It's really about speaking with the individual of what feels best. And that's where I come back to that. Well, how do you feel when you've been on social media for an hour? How do you feel when you've been on social media for 3 hours? Do you notice a difference in your mood? Do you notice that you feel maybe more inspired when you're on there for an hour? Do you feel more groggy? Do you feel more negative when you've been on there for 3 hours? How do you feel when you take a break from social media? Again, not like don't go on there, but like, have you noticed that, it's provided space to do some other activities or to stay present? And again, like it's just more of empowering the teen, like
Yeah.
employing the kind of
Okay.
curious mindset of seeking to learn can help the teen feel empowered that they're figuring it out on their own versus me saying, okay, well, after, 45 minutes or, whatever length of time is, you're going to absorb this in a negative way. It's going to help them say, oh, I have the awareness and I'm learning myself what works for me.
Yeah, I like that approach. It's similar to even the awareness around food and things that we want a young body to learn, like what feels good to you, what feels good in your system. Did you feel energized? Did you feel tired?
Yes, totally, totally. And I feel that, and again, I know it's a general statement. And, I also remind parents and clinicians, any adult, that this obviously is going to take time. It's not just the teen's going to think about this one day and then it's going to click for them. It, can take weeks, months, years, however long, but it can really help the teen feel more connected with themselves. And these are really good tools for the teen to carry with them into adulthood too, to feel more connected.
Hmm.
Okay. Of like, how am I feeling about this situation versus like what other people are telling me here, and feeling confident, kind of navigating this internally.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to an example that you gave a couple of minutes ago when you said, then what's going to happen when they're 18 and in
Mhm.
a way, and those limits or those standards have all of a sudden come down. I thought the same thing, like by listening to your body and really starting to be in touch with what feels good and what access to social media helps you feel like your best self. Those are skills that you'll always have through college and beyond. That awareness is something that even adults are still building, but to start to be really familiar with the signs and symptoms earlier is a really neat awareness.
Yes, 100%, 100%. And I know I'm also coming back to this too, but a big part of my work with the teens involves them gaining empathy and compassion for their parents if the parents are not doing this, just understanding that parents are trying to protect the teen and kind of doing the best that they can, which again, it's understandable. It's scary to say, okay, let me like kind of take my hands off the wheel and let the teen kind of figure this out on their own. So again, helpful for teens to have empathy for their parents, and then vice versa for parents to recognize that by them taking their hands off the wheel and letting the teen figure this out on their own while they're still living at home where there is a bit of a safety net there is really helpful for the teen moving forward, because oftentimes when a teen has been so, I don't want to say sheltered, but whether it's sheltered, been protected, or, been living in an environment where their parents have really tried to prohibit them from certain activities, they really struggle when they move out. They really feel like a fish out of water. So that's reminding parents that it's actually really helping the teen in the long run, even though it's scary.
So you had used an example of just briefly of a math test. Like, how often are they getting nervous? How anxious are they getting? What types of symptoms? What might be an approach you and the book outline for parents in terms of someone who does have quite a bit of anxiety from the moment they hear about the test or the assignment until the moment it's starting and beyond? What's your take on what parents can do to offer support?
Like I said, this is a generalized take
Mhm.
on this, but generally speaking, this is where I encourage parents to engage in a two-sided dialogue with the teen. We can get into kind of more of the specifics of like how to even open up that dialogue, but that's where
Sure.
we want the parent to really talk to the teen about what this is like for them and how it feels for them, and asking open-ended questions that are not yes or no questions if we can avoid them, where also the parent is asking the teen how the parent can support them and what the teen feels might help them and what they can do together to help the teen feel more confident. And, additionally, this, it's helpful for teens to know that they can get more support if needed, and for parents to also be open and receptive to that if their teen does benefit or require from more support. I talk about in the book of, how to open that type of conversation and what that might look like too, that support. Obviously, as a therapist, I'm biased that I'm always going to be supportive of any teen going to therapy at any time. But that there are other types of support that might benefit the teen. So for also the parent to have that conversation with the teenager, again, collaborative, mindful, curious, inquisitive versus a fixing solution type conversation.
Mhm. Yeah. Is there room to do some of that internal assessment piece with other things? I think social anxiety is very common. Kids thinking, I don't want to maybe go here where there are going to be people. It's hard for me to start conversations. I don't
Yeah.
want to reach out to my friends to maybe see them in person and things like
Hmm.
that. So,
Yeah.
do you encourage kind of that assessment with how you're feeling before and after if you do something like that?
Definitely. Definitely. 100%, in all of these types of areas, and I talk about this in the book too, is also talking about difficult subjects with teenagers. A lot of times parents will avoid also discussing topics like substance use and sex and sexuality with their teens from that, stance of wanting to protect them or coming from a place of care. But recognizing those topics can cause a huge amount of anxiety for teenagers. And it's helpful for parents to also navigate their own anxieties talking about this with their teen to help the teenager. Oftentimes it's not just, okay, I'm anxious before a test. It's I'm anxious before a party. I'm anxious before hanging out with a friend. I'm anxious with trying a new activity. I'm anxious of just going outside. There's a lot of people in our world, and again, we're living in a very different world than parents experienced in their own adolescence. So I'd say in all areas, it's helpful to employ this technique. Again, like I said, unless there's emergency situation, there are going to be some exceptions, of course.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you talk a little bit about moving to a bit of a coaching role, like moving from that really directive type of parenting that we might do with a young child to kind of examining and softening that approach as kids grow and get more independence. Can you talk about what you suggest for that in the book?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I always remind parents that it's okay that this is going to feel really challenging and that it's okay if they haven't done this yet and they feel they've made some, quote unquote mistakes. And it's going to take time, because really what it is it's for parents kind of relearning how to parent. If we think of like young children, like we kind of have to provide more solutions and more fix it. Like, if a baby's crying, we don't say like, how do you feel about that? We give them the bottle. We change their diaper. We make sure that they're cared for. Whereas with the teen is kind of emerging into adulthood and is starting to value being treated more like an adult versus a kid. So it's almost like this kind of weird gray area. Like people say adolescence is so awkward because of all, the physical changes, but it's awkward for the parent because of all the parenting changes too, so it's a kind of murky gray area where, parents are going to want to work with the teen, not providing the solutions for the teen, but also recognizing that the teen is also not a full grown adult yet, but they're also not a full on child anymore. So it is this like kind of gray area here. And that's why, it's really helpful for parents to work with the teen, ask the open-ended questions, have two-sided conversation versus this is what you do, this is what you don't do. It helps the teen be empowered.
Have you noticed any upticks or do you mention any upticks in anxiety following COVID or because of COVID? I know at the time we could probably all say we were seeing a huge influx of anxiety symptoms in our adolescent population, but I'm wondering if those are lasting.
I do. And a bit of a side note, and this is kind of more the topic of the second book that I'm working on, is for a little bit of the older demographic, is really for, kind of teens that are getting ready to graduate and either go join the workforce or go to college, take a gap year. Is I've also noticed there have been delays too, and kind of more of the emotional development, and this is obviously generally speaking, it's not for every teenager, but I have noticed not just the rise in anxiety of, because we were at home for so long, many teenagers missed out on kind of these like pivotal moments to kind of shape their adolescence, but that things have been delayed. So like I'm noticing that where I live in Los Angeles in California, like whereas most teens were ready to get their license when they were 16, they're getting it now when they're 18 or 19. Or I'm noticing more people are starting to date not in high school, but right when they go to college, or that there's just kind of a little bit more of a delay. And that's something as a clinician too, that I'm kind of wrapping my head around a bit as well, that like, if I'm seeing a 16-year-old now working with them in therapy, oftentimes I'm like, okay, well, this 16-year-old had some very pivotal years during lockdown, whereas now the 16-year-old might feel a bit more like a 14-year-old to me than a 16-year-old I would have seen in my practice 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's something that, again, I'm kind of just mindful of too, that we had such a pause in the development to a certain extent. Like I said, it's not for everyone, but something that I kind of keep close tabs on.
Yeah, that sounds so interesting.
Yeah.
We'll have to have you back to
Oh, thank
talk
you.
about the second book.
Yeah. In the works now.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
Does it have an anxiety focus? as well,
Yes,
or
yes.
more just developmental in
Yeah, it's a
general?
bit of the anxiety, but really the second book goes into more detail about rescuing and enabling versus helping the
Um,
teen effectively go into independence, because I touch upon those subjects in the book, but I feel there's way more to kind of unfold there of how parents can feel more comfortable, kind of letting the teen sort of spread their wings at that point, knowing that they're really right on the cusp of like being an adult, but still being a teenager, and also keeping in mind that we've had some delays too in the development. It's like this kind of uncharted territory here, and kind of preventing the sort of failure to launch type syndrome that I think we see a little bit more of now. But anxiety, depression, of course, mentions is discussed in that, and also there's a significant component about substance use too, if teenagers are going to college, and how to kind of navigate that culture as well. So it just kind of goes into more detail about some of those subjects.
oh, that sounds so interesting. You're right. It is
Yeah.
kind of cool to think about that we're seeing this shift in what developmental stages are expected.
Yeah.
Sort of like
Mhm.
when the dictionary adapts a new word, it's like what
Exactly.
you might challenge a family with would be different considering not where they should be by our standards a decade ago, but like what's
Yes.
developmentally appropriate given the landscape now.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's a definitely kind of new learning area for adults, clinicians, for everyone involved. It's tricky.
Have you integrated this book into your clinical practice, and how have you seen it go? How are you using it?
Oh, yes. Yes. So I want to say, 80% of the book is really coming from my work in my private practice, and the rest are my work at schools and in residential treatment centers. But really the reason why I'm kind of drawing this on my private practice is because it's longer term therapy. But I've seen this go really, really well, and I post some kind of case studies where there have been some success stories kind of like sprinkled in the book. Of course, all the names have been changed and everything for confidentiality, but they're all based off of real life work with whether just the teen or with the teen and their families. Also, there are times where I work with just parents too, but I feel it's been really, really helpful. Again, it's very skills based and practical tools. So, like, this is the other piece of it too, is not everyone has the time, the money also to go to long term therapy too. And obviously, this book is not a replacement for therapy at all, but really for parents to, again, just have a frame of reference of what can I say to help. Again, what is a like a specific phrase I can use when I'm trying to open up a conversation? What are some kind of like inside secrets from a therapist?
Yeah, I love that. What else would be important to share about the book?
Yeah. So, I've kind of touched on this a bit here, but the book, my intention with this book is also to really come from a lens of compassion also for the parents too, so it's definitely written in a tone that's more empathetic, where I remind parents, again, if let's say they have done the exact opposite of everything that's mentioned in the book,
Yeah.
that it's okay, that it's really normalizing how challenging parenting is, and how challenging parenting an anxious teen is, and reminding parents that it is okay, and that they have been coming from a good stance with their approaches. And it can just be helpful to integrate some new tools, to experiment, and also for parents, there's a big section on this, but for parents to also make sure they have their own support and their own self care here too. And obviously, I go into more detail about what that might look like, how that can benefit the parent, how it can benefit the teen, what the ripple effect of that is. But it's to help parents feel better, not just for the teen, but also for themselves too. So that's really my goal with the book, to help the parents and help the teen.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. And I hear parents say a lot that they didn't recognize their experience as anxiety until they saw it through their child's eyes.
Totally, totally, and, a last kind of little tidbit too, and I remind people about this all the time, and it might feel like a no-brainer, but it's really important for us to remember. The teens are not expert communicators. Like, they're not going to
Mm.
sit down with the parent. I mean, I always joke that I'm like, maybe there's a teen out there that says this. I haven't met them yet, but, that is going to sit with the parent and say, Mom, Dad, I'm really struggling. I could use some coping skills and emotional regulation techniques and tools to self soothe. Like, no, the teen is not going to say that. The teen is most likely going to say, like, everything sucks. I hate this. I don't want to go to school. I'm worthless. It's going to be verbalized in that way. So it can be really, really easy to, I don't want to say overlook this, but you really have to read between the lines here.
You're right. It's interesting to think that it takes a whole vocabulary for us to explain some of these things sometimes. And so we'd be remiss to expect a teen to come on deck having that vocabulary ready.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing too is often it's hard for parents if, let's say, their teen is very high functioning or is very articulate or does really well in school, like to
Mm.
remind themselves of that even if, like, on paper, they seem very mature and very self-aware, they're still teenagers and they still are developing the skills and tools and the communication strategies that they'll get as an adult.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it stands to reason that in some areas the parents are developing this vocabulary too. So
Totally. Yeah.
So, assuming that everyone's coming into the conversation being able to articulate the experiences is not the full picture.
Exactly.
You gave a great segue into a question I like to ask
Yeah.
everyone that comes on. What do you use for self-care, or what you just mentioned, what do you recommend to these parents and teens for self-care?
I talk about this in the book that, self care can look different for everyone. So, my self care, I love like hobbies. So that's always my self care: gardening, yoga, reading, doing art, so many of those type of skills. Also, getting your own therapy, your own coaching, your own counseling. Oftentimes parents overlook that. And I encourage parents to remember how important that is to practice their own self care. So whether it be, a hobby, a walk, exercising, or just seeking their own therapy or their own forms of support, it's so helpful and so important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Now, I read a little article in the last week or two that you wrote about considerations for writing a parenting book. And I wondered if you could just share a little bit about what that process was like for any of our counterparts that are curious about what goes into it and how you get started.
Oh, thank you so much for asking that. And thank you for reading my article. Yes.
Yeah.
So I really recommend, and the article is called 5 Steps for Writing a Successful Parenting Book. So, because I like to kind of break things down step by step. And for anyone who's interested in writing, what I recommend is definitely picking a specific demographic or population and really kind of detailing that down. So, versus, let's talk about just like anxiety in general. Let's talk about anxiety in adolescence, or, ADHD in the 5 to 8 year old range versus like ADHD for everyone. So really getting specific with that, I think kind of narrowing that down is really, really helpful. And I personally, and this is one of the steps that I list too, is to make it accessible. So that was really my goal for this book. Like I always say, and this was kind of the get-go from the beginning, is I wanted a person with a PhD to pick this up and feel that it spoke to them, and a person who didn't finish high school to pick this up and say, I don't need to study this for years, months, days. I can start applying this right away. And to provide practical strategies and tools for them versus going into, okay, here's the cause, here's the cause, like this is why it's happening, this is like, these are the statistics, great, super important, but I come from the stance of, well, now what do we do about
Mhm.
that? And people are so yearning for those skills and for those tools, and people are going to want to read that if they're going to learn something that they can use at home.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then any thoughts on after it's written?
What do you do
Get
with
it
it?
published or yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So for my book, I wrote a proposal and I did some research into, which publishing companies can accept a book without a literary agent because I wasn't using a literary agent. I was submitting it on my own and writing, a proposal is quite a lengthy process. So that's, you're including it's a whole sort of pitch of who this is going to appeal to, what's your market plan, including sample chapters, contents. But once that was done, I submitted it to a number of places and I just kind of put it out there to the universe that I said, all right, whichever is meant to be. And if it doesn't work out, then, the great thing is like there's also self publishing too. So while this book is not self published, I had that in my back pocket that, this book's going to
Yeah.
get out there one way or another, which is so cool with like the world we're living in with self publishing. But fortunately, publishing house picked it up. And I had done some research too in terms of this publishing house of what types of books that they publish. So I wasn't, submitting this to publishing companies that are all fiction and no nonfiction and,
Yeah.
no kind of I was very intentional with where I submitted it. And the great thing with the publishing company, so it's called Hatherley Press and it's a small publishing company, but it's distributed by Penguin Random House. So, the book kind of gets out there to all the stores, the Barnes and Noble, the independent bookstores. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. But I've really encouraged people, and I know it might sound a bit cheesy, but, to kind of navigate their fear that, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? If someone says no, okay, it's not meant to be, you can always hold off and submit it again to other publishing houses or self-publish it. It's amazing. And also people who self-publish do wind up getting picked up by publishing companies down the road too, or for your second book. So it's an amazing world out there for writers now. I feel like there's a lot of opportunities and it's different than how it used to be. So I encourage them to
It's
go for it.
Yeah, I love it. It's neat to hear how you kind of worked through anxiety limiting blocks that could have
Yes.
popped up by
Yeah,
just kind of having an idea on how you would persevere through the different
totally.
barriers. And that's pretty hardcore that you researched it without a literary agent and you figured out how to pave that way for yourself. So
Thank
I think it's a
you.
great little lesson for
Thank
us.
you. Thank you. And I honestly had fun doing it. And I kept going back to this mentality, which is that if someone has a message out there that's going to help people, that's awesome. Like, let's bring it out there into the world. That I'm like, even if this helps just one person, that's great.
I agree. I think what really excited me about just hearing your story and seeing your book is that I think that a lot of our counterparts in the field have a message to say and to be disseminated. And so I like to see an LCSW doing it
Yeah.
because sometimes when you're looking, it's maybe coaches and doctors, all of whose voices are so important. And I think there are other voices that are really important to hear too. So I thought that was really
Definitely.
cool.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I encourage anyone who wants to write to sit down and do it. And, someone said to me while I was kind of starting this process, and I really liked it, is they said, if you write 1 page a day, you have a book in a year. So granted, I full transparency did not write every day for a year, but still like going in with that mentality.
Yeah.
If I really wanted to have a full book done in a year, I just have to write a page a day. And it feels very doable versus like, I have to write an entire book and I'm just sitting down with like a blank Word document. It's like, where do I start? Kind of step by step is better.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor
Mhm.
that it becomes a big thing by starting with a little thing, because I think that starting part, as we know, is the hang up for most people.
100%, and for any clinician, works with substance use or, anyone who's, in recovery or trying to get sober, it is that kind of one step at a time when we look at things from a really big scale. It's like, wait, never mind, I'm not even going to try, but versus like, let's just break it down into small steps.
Yeah. Okay, anything else that you want to talk about?
If anyone has more questions, they can always reach out to me on my website. The book is available Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Walmart, local bookstores. Porchlight Books is another place that we do bulk sales for the book. Or, if anyone can't find it for any reason, they just reach out to me and I can help them.
Yeah, okay, that's great. I'll link everything in the show notes. And just for a fun final
Yeah.
request, would you be able to share a case study or a little vignette of somebody who kind of walked through the process that maybe you shared the story in the book?
Yeah. Yeah,
Sure.
definitely. I was working with a teenager and really, and this was an interesting kind of experience because I was working with a teenager about their anxiety, and the teenager was very adamant about not wanting to do family therapy, which, I
Mm-hmm.
respected. And also, and this is more my kind of personal preferences, that when a teenager does decide to do family therapy, that they really do long-term family therapy with a separate therapist. But what we talked about is maybe having their parents come in just for a few sessions, so not family therapy, but more for the teenager to express to the parent. And obviously, we walked through this, we processed it, what it was going to be like for the teen to share with the parents what would help them feel better in terms of how the parents could support them. So this goes back to the we work together for the teen to figure out really on their own with my guidance, supporting them, of the teen wanting the parent to say, hey, don't tell me to go meditate when I'm feeling stressed. Don't tell me to go for a
Mm.
walk when I'm feeling stressed. Ask me what that's like for me, versus trying to be a teacher to me. And the parent really opened up and shared, with their teenager, which is very vulnerable for the parent, of like, it's really hard for me. It goes against my instinct as a parent to just sit back and watch you struggle. I want to intervene. I want to jump in. I want to fix it. It's really hard for me. So also be patient with me. Well, I'm learning, which was wonderful. Again, I was fortunate that I had a parent who was open and receptive to that. That's not always the case, as we
Sure.
as clinicians know. But it was really collaborative because what happened is they both left feeling, and of course, this is after a couple of sessions, but that it wasn't family therapy. It was more like a guidance and how to communicate with each other, and for both people to have empathy. So again, it's not just the parent having empathy for the teen, it's helping the teen have empathy for the parent, and oftentimes it's a little more challenging,
Sure.
but I think seeing that the parent was trying their best helped the teenager.
Yeah, I mean, and you gave a little disclaimer throughout that was like, and these are well-intentioned, loving parents most of the time, and so I think that is important for the child to understand too. This is not coming from a place of malice. We're not trying to say the wrong thing or trying to be annoying or turn up the heat. We're just trying, like, it's coming from a loving, supportive place. And with a little
Course.
bit of education, there might be some
Course.
room to meet closer
Yeah.
to the
Yeah. And
expert.
reminding teenagers that parents are still human beings and they don't have it all together.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. Such
Uh-huh.
a good message for our younger folks.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was so nice talking to you,
Yeah,
Sophia.
it
Good
was so
luck
nice
with
chatting with
the
you.
rest of your launch.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Self-Carapist podcast. If you did, please subscribe and feel free to leave a review. You can also follow along at the Self-Carapist on Instagram or head to lorrainemoorhead.com/podcast to grab a free copy of your own learning map worksheet to help track all of the tools and strategies you're interested in learning more about. See you next Wednesday.